Hello and welcome to another episode of the Silk and Steel podcast. I'm your host, Carl Zha. Today I have back on the show Mr. Warwick Powell, distinguished professor from Australia. Professor Warwick, you are very much requested on my show. Many people love your
Good.
appearance. There's a couple of things I want to talk to you about today. Your recent articles that you have written for your Substack. I know you are a very prolific writer. I saw you have many new articles now posted on your Substack. Maybe you can give us my audience just a general rundown of your thoughts.
Yeah. Look. Well, I'll start actually with the fact that I learned to touch type when I was 16, and that's been incredibly helpful. At the time when my father made me go and learn to touch type on a computer, I thought that it was a stupid thing to do. But I guess that's just another example of where those older than you are often wiser than you. I also was fortunate enough to benefit from a working environment where I was forced to initially, but ultimately developed an ability to dictate, which allows you to be quite productive. Okay, so in that sense, it helps me take all the crazy ideas that are racing through my head and turn them onto words on a screen reasonably quickly. The body of work really focuses on a series of interrelated themes, and the themes really are anchored by something that I've come to call either a systemic exchange value framework of thinking about economic systems, or probably in more interesting or more marketable terms, this idea of thermoeconomics. And that's the idea that human societies, economic systems, are fundamentally material in nature, and they involve energy transformations, right? We are natural. This is how nature works. And the substrate of our societies and our economic systems is actually how we harness energy from nature, mobilize that through work, and create new forms of energy that are actually useful for human societies, both in short-term terms and also in terms of the institutions and the resources that we make available for things that go beyond reproduction. So there's a very materialist view, if you will, around our economic systems. Intersecting all of this is the idea that we have monetary considerations. And I guess my starting point on questions around money really derives from very early on thinking from the 1800s and even into the 1900s, which views money in some respects as an endogenous feature of economic systems, and is in large part a claim on the future, right? So I don't sort of view money as a thing that people have, let alone a thing that we have scarcity about because we have to find it in nature. But money is really a promise that we make that enables us to exchange for things in the future. So it's a claim into the future. And the third part of all of this, which is the bit that actually always interested me far more than the other elements, is the role of information. So information systems actually hold all of this together, because without that, these different circuits, if you will, of monetary autonomy, of material and energetic transformations in the world don't coordinate properly. And when they don't coordinate properly, by the way, we have major problems, right? So we saw that in the global financial crisis when the monetary circuits essentially spun off into orbit. They became totally detached from the ability of the real world to keep up. And once there were more claims being made on the future than the future could deliver, we started to get crises. But we also have other kinds of crises too. And the fundamental crisis that we constantly face is this tension between this idea of entropy, right, which is the complexity of systems and the breaking up of systems, and that's part of the natural world, with human efforts to counteract that, right, which is to bring order, bring shape, bring consistency and stability. And this dialectic at work between the natural dynamics of energetic systems, which is towards entropy, and human efforts to control that, I think are fundamentally key drivers to the challenges and opportunities that we have. And one way of thinking about that, I'm rushing through a bit of this, Carl, but I hope your viewers will bear with it, is this idea that because we're interested in how energy underpins everything, what makes modern societies work is our ability to continually improve the energy return on energy invested. So when humans go out there and mobilize resources in the world and then convert those resources into energy forms that we find useful, whether by burning things or making things move and stuff, the amount of energy that we have to use to get access to this next batch of energy, that's the energy return on energy invested. And the higher that is, the more surplus energy there is beyond what we need to reproduce that activity. Right? So think of it like a hunting animal, right? That the tiger that has to hunt for its food to be able to sustain itself. So when a tiger happens to catch an animal and consumes it, the energy that it gets from that animal through nutrition and all of that must be enough for that tiger not only to be able to catch the next animal, but it actually must be enough for that tiger to chase and fail to catch 6 other animals and also lie around and also breed and spend time protecting you know young tigers from threats. So the surplus energy that comes from what has been caught and consumed must actually enable all these other things to happen. Um, One of the areas that I do a lot of work in as a result of all of this is actually telling alternative stories about the Chinese economy. So I tend to use the Chinese economy, if you will, as my sounding board. And that draws on my sort of long-standing academic interests and eventually professional interests in what's happening in China, not to mention personal interests. And so I try to bring all these threads together, right? It's usually my way of thinking about the world, Carl, trying to figure it out for myself first and foremost, right? And perhaps because I'm a glutton for punishment, perhaps because if there's one thing I'm okay at, I'm able to at least communicate some of these ideas. I find it's a nice way, firstly, to get all this stuff together, sort it all out in my own mind, and by sharing it, maybe help other people think about the world as well.
Um, just to piggyback on some of your ideas, I mean, I find this energy-based thinking quite fascinating because this kind of corresponds to our more recent history with the industrial revolution. Was essentially human beings start to unlock the power of fossil fuels, and suddenly they get access to this new source of abundant energy, and then later they move from coal to even more efficient fossil fuel like oil and gas. And now it looks like we are in the next phase. China is leading the way in many aspects. For example, in exploring the renewable. China has made the solar panels price fall 98% in the past 2 decades, for example. But go along those veins, I'm actually thinking about United States, because US actually do have abundant hydrocarbon resources, particularly after the shale, the fracking shale revolution. And United States also have deployed a lot of capital in the information space. So US is actually in many aspects leading in, for example, in AI and information technology. Then why the overall sense, even inside the US, is that US is in trouble somehow? Like it should
Yep.
have everything going for it, right? It has abundant energy, you have all the information technology at its disposal, and it has the ability to brain drain from the rest of the world to suck the human capital to US. Why is it seems things are falling apart?
Well, I think we can look at the three threads, right, which is this energetic transformation thread, the financial thread, and the information thread. So these are the three sort of core elements that I guess constitute the critical parameters of my own theoretical thinking about social and economic systems. And in fact, information itself is an energetic thing, right? Which we don't normally think about that way. You know, we often just treat information as a free something or another, right? But information itself is deeply energetic because it requires certain amounts of energy to collect information, to store information, to disseminate information, to process information, etc., etc. And AI actually is a great way of understanding how energetically embodied information can be. But one of the challenges in thinking about, I think, places like the United States, but not only the US, but generally countries and civilizations around the world, is to understand the ebbs and flows of this issue of the energy return on energy invested. So EROEI, I think, is the key that helps us unlock some of these mysteries. The United States did have abundant and high EROEI energy resources. It was, the oil was more or less floating to the surface, right, back in the day. So it was actually very easy to extract and relatively straightforward to move from point A to point B. As time went by, of course, as you take away the easy stuff, you end up having to commit more and more energy to get the next hit, so to speak. And eventually it reached a point where, with some of the fracking now, it is increasingly difficult. It requires more energetic effort to get the next joule of energy available for humans to put to work. It certainly hasn't reached negative territory by any stretch of the imagination, but what it means as your EROEI gets smaller is that those surpluses available for other social and economic things diminishes. So think about that animal that tiger caught. We're having to spend more money. That tiger's having to spend more energy running after a faster but scrawnier animal. So when it does catch something, it's actually getting less energy, having spent more energy getting it. That's the dilemma that I think the US is in. Now, it can change that equation through a number of things. One is through technological advancements, which of course have uncertainty attached to them. It may or may not work. We may discover new ways of tapping hydrocarbons that weren't available before, and that makes it more energy efficient. Another way, of course, is to shift to things like nuclear. And the third way is, of course, moving into this sort of renewable space. The challenge in the US is that energy has been heavily politicized through vested interests and ideology, whereas China literally doesn't have that level of politicization over energy. Yeah, sure, there are parts of a country that are more abundant in coal, for example, and coal will, whilst it's been growing, plays a proportionately lesser role in the growth, but it doesn't have the same sort of political pull as oil interests do in the United States, for example. So I think that's your first problem that the United States confronts. The second one is this AI issue and how that intersects with energy. And because energy is actually increasingly more expensive to make available, and the delivery infrastructure is not up to scratch to be able to get electricity to where it needs to go, given the proliferation of new uses, namely AI data centers, you run into a few challenges. One is that AI data centers start to compete with other demands for electricity. And the one thing that always does is that it drives up prices, and we're seeing that. The second thing that's doing is that it also means that that the energetic cost of information processing rises as well. So suddenly something that, in theory, should have been incredibly low cost energy-wise, not just financially, but energy-wise, actually becomes higher cost than we ever thought. And if we actually understand information as embodied energy as well, then we do actually have to confront the fact that not all information is good information if that information costs more energy to make available, than the energetic benefits of that information. In other words, does that information help us deal with entropy? Does it help us coordinate things better? Does it help us create new technologies, etc., etc.? And if you end up with an AI infrastructure that focuses on adults only, fan style stuff, or whatever else Sam Altman's talked about, then that arguably is actually not energy productive, right? As a way of that kind of information is actually not an energy productive use of information. So I think that they're the challenges the US faces. Whereas when you go to a place like China, there's a lot less of that stuff. There's also much less effort put into pursuing, human or Western humanity's aspirations to replace God. So there's very little sense that AI is about artificial general intelligence. When I talk to colleagues in China in the AI space in particular, no one ever talks to me about artificial intelligence. It just doesn't seem to be the driver. What seems to be the driver, of course, is things like how do we embed this so that calculations can be done quicker, smarter, more accurately, so that something else can happen quickly. Right? So it's all about creating abundance again, constantly about speed, abundance, making surplus energy available for other things. I saw on X recently, an American Chinese scholar visited China and came back saying, didn't see AI anywhere explicitly being used by Chinese consumers. Well, that's the point. Most of the AI is actually embedded in the back engine. There's no button that says AI. It literally is happening in the back engine, enabling things like drones to deliver things quicker, cheaper, transport systems to work quicker, cheaper, more efficiently, ports to unload container ships in 40 minutes instead of 8 hours. That's where this is all happening now. So I think the US actually, in terms of the US, I think part of the challenge is the accumulated surplus energies over historical time is a lot. We've also got a financial circuit that has literally spun out of control, which means that there is actually a lot of financial capability, meaning that the claims that can be made on the future are huge. The problem for America at the moment is that the future really isn't in a position to deliver on all those claims.
But you talk about the role of money, and US is actually in control of the money supply, right? I mean, like
kinda. Right. Part of the difficulty with this idea of controlling money supply is that the vast majority of money capital floating through the economic system in America actually comes from bank credit. No one directly controls that. That comes from borrowers seeking credit and commercial banks taking the view that the borrowers are credit worthy. So there's all this. So credit actually comes that way, which enters into the system. Obviously, there's also government spending, but government spending as a proportion of these two line items, so to speak, is actually in the minority. So there is no authority that can actually control money supply. What they try to do is manage system liquidity, right? Which is what taxes is all about. And so when taxes are imposed, and temporary system liquidity management tools as well, which is what financial products is all about, right? Give me your US dollars in exchange, I'll give you something which allows you to make a claim on something or another down the track, whether it's shares, whether it's options, whether it's a contract for difference, whether it's a debt instrument like a federal government-backed bond. It can be any of these things, but they're trying to drain dollars out of the system at the same time. So if you imagine an economic system as a bunch of buckets and pipes, you've got all these taps everywhere pouring in, and then you've got to drain it because the buckets do grow, but they can only grow at a certain rate. And if you've got too much flowing, eventually things overflow. So they're creating new buckets as well, right? So finance is fantastic for this because it actually doesn't take much effort or time to create a financial instrument. Regulated as it is, suddenly you've got a new financial instrument, a whole bunch of institutional liquidity gets poured into it. And so it drains money capital out of the system again in exchange for an interest rate. So this is what they're constantly trying to do, trying to, at an aggregate level, manage liquidity levels, not always successfully. But the other feature of this circulation system is that most of this circulation literally circulates to the top, and that in and of itself depletes the real economy of the money capital that could be used to mobilize real resources. So because those who accumulate money capital and actually end up accumulating masses of fictitious capital assets, the claims on the future, rights. Not that much of it goes in, relatively speaking, goes into significant renewing of fixed capital, factories, machines, and all that sort of stuff.
But Professor, what about trickle-down economy? I mean, doesn't the wealth start trickle down from the top to the bottom?
Well, it's a great theory, for those who have the wealth, and it's a very bad reality for those who have to suffer.
Yeah, that's fair. How would let's say how the Trump reaction is apparently an attempt to try to fix the mess the U.S. is in, and it's so far not very successful. Is it possible at this point to fix the structural problems that U.S. faces? With a highly financialized economy, lots of vested interest, and almost gridlock a political system. Is there any hope for reform?
Look, it's very hard for softly reforms, and even I think the efforts by this administration, you probably wouldn't call them traditional softly reforms, but even that is really not shaking the system structurally, right? So, in part, it's premised on a misdiagnosis of the problem. It sees symptoms, but it has misdiagnosed causes. And so, for instance, it sees trade and trade imbalances as a problem to be solved, and it thinks you solve that by dealing with relative prices via tariffs that will affect the flows at a trade level. The problem is that trade is really just a function of production distribution, right? And you've got to go to the heart of the question, which is if we're buying lots of stuff, it's because we're not making that stuff. Right? Stopping this stuff coming isn't the answer. We've got to figure out why it is that we don't make this stuff, and then figure out how it is that we can make this stuff in a way that is comparable to the stuff that we buy. And you've got to always come back to fixing production systems. And what are production systems? As we were discussing earlier, they're just energetic transformation systems in large part. So you've got to solve that. You've got to tackle this question of energy systems in the long run. Once you can solve energy systems in the long run, you've got a chance of solving information systems that are energetic in part, but are necessary to releasing the productive forces, so to speak. None of that is part of the agenda at the moment. Now, we can go into all sorts of things that make viable production economies actually work. You need a workforce that has the right skills. You need people with reasonably high levels of literacy and numeracy. That's actually not what the contemporary United States delivers. It actually does the reverse, which means it has to pull people in from around the world, which then exacerbates a bunch of social problems because there are sections of the American community that hate that idea. So then you've got finance. Given their druthers, finance capital will happily trade for profit through financial instruments than take the punt on investing in a 3 to 5 year fixed capital project where the returns are uncertain. And so unless you can bring finance to heel and cause finance to actually be committed to not just buying more capital equipment and building a box around it, but committing to investing in the people and the systems and the processes, none of that's going to matter either, right? So the accumulated problems that exist, the symptoms that people are concerned about. Uh, this has resulted from 40 to 50 years. You don't fix that in 4 to 5 days. You don't even fix that in 4 years. And you certainly don't fix it by, in a sense, creating fights for yourself all around the world. Right? That actually doesn't fix your problems. It might create some nice optics politically. It, in some respects, mobilizes this idea of a politics of nostalgia, right, as well as a politics of cultural grievance. It's either equity this or it's woke that or what have you. But it doesn't go to the heart of the problem, which is why does finance capital have limited relative interest in fixed capital formation and high-end manufacturing and high-end industry, as opposed to hiring financial engineers on Wall Street, right? Unless you tackle that, how are you going to fix this? Right? Besant talks about Wall Street and Main Street rising together. The reason why Main Street's in the hole that it's in is because Wall Street has risen so much. You don't fix it by thinking you can leave Wall Street alone. Um, the heart of the American political economy today is that it's overly financialized. There's lots of vested interest attached to that, and now you've got the next batch of rent seekers, basically, and they are your technology oligarchs, right? Who have very little interest in commodifying their platforms, but they have a lot of vested interest in building moats around them and locking people in at high prices.
Well, speaking of energy based, there are countries like China, but also previously like Japan and South Korea that was energy poor. Yet they were able to build a successful modern economy despite that. I mean, which like
Yep.
US, I mean, comparatively, US is actually in a better problem, in a better position resource wise than either Korea, Japan, or until very recently China, right? I mean, so it doesn't seem like the energy um, is all determinative on
Yeah.
how the path of development of a state, right? Because there are example of Japan,
Correct.
Korea, China, despite being energy poor, and somehow was able to build a modern industrial economy.
Well, it harnessed energy from elsewhere, right? So
Right.
it solved its energy, its local energy challenges, and of course, China's moving to a point where it is solving them in a sovereign way as well. So it's reducing the dependence on imported energy sources. And look, if anybody, if people were given their druthers, and you're playing the world game, and you said, look, there's all these places that you could get. Where would you choose? Well, I tell you, North America would be one of those places that would be chosen, one of the first few. What an amazing gift of nature, right? And unsurprisingly, with those gifts of nature, the United States, as the population grew, obviously as it moved westward, it killed a whole bunch of, it actually engaged in what some historians have called the world's largest genocide in terms of the American Indians. But insofar as, let's call it, just economic wealth creation is concerned, put everything else aside, it's just one of the most amazing gifts of nature to have the opportunity to do something with. Certainly compared to a bunch of other countries, Japan's a great example. It's energy poor, it's food poor, it's topographically very difficult, it's on earthquake fault line. It's one of the last places you would choose if you wanted to have an easy pathway to improving material conditions. Yeah, look, the United States. I've been accused actually of being a little bit more optimistic about the US than some of my friends, which is a bit surprising to me because I've never really been particularly optimistic. But I just think that there are incredible raw materials. Look, you yourself studied there. You've spent time there. Um, there is no doubt that it's a country of 350 million people or so. Its education systems are actually not, they're not in the bucket yet. They're not, there are problems with literacy and numeracy. There are problems with the economics of education, but it's not like there aren't bright people. There's lots of bright people. There's lots of raw materials. There's lots of legacy infrastructure. Some of it desperately needs upgrading, whether it's rail lines or electricity systems, or some of its road networks, or some of its ports for that matter, that look like ports from the 1970s. But compared to many other countries in the world, this is still amazing stuff. A lot can be done, and I think the United States, once it can become a normal country and be less obsessed with being a global hegemon, and less paranoid about the idea that everyone else wants to do harm to the United States. If it can do all of those things and focus a lot more on distributional issues and institution building domestically, there's no reason why it can't actually have an incredibly prosperous future.
I agree. Unfortunately, at the current with the current political landscape, I don't see any kind of changes possible in the immediate future. Maybe in a generation's time, maybe in 20 years, 30 years, things might change. But I just don't see a path to improvement within next 2 to 5 years. It's
Look,
which is
the political
unfortunate.
economy, with deep-seated vested interests, with a political system that is designed around the flow of money, 2-year electoral cycles, lobbyists coming through the doors, revolving doors, the need for campaign finance to actually play the game. None of that is conducive to being able to tackle the issues in essence, in a dispassionate way. And that means that as times get more difficult, and I'm actually quite certain that they will, the anxiety levels and the public anger will rise. And the short-term political response will be to raise more and more money to run the campaigns. But the mandates are incredibly thin as a result, and there isn't a politician that then is able to do anything. The electoral system in the United States was designed 250 years ago, principally to favour small agrarian states, principally to ensure that systems were largely gridlocked so that there couldn't be radical change, and it also meant, because of the college system, that these days a president is elected with what is in effect about 30%, give or take, of the eligible voter base. That's it, right? So that's a very, very thin mandate, if you can even call it that. They might get a massive winner's bonus at the college, right, which makes it look like they've romped it in. But when you actually look at the votes across a country, you realise that a whole bunch of folk didn't bother voting at all. A whole bunch of voters didn't vote for whoever became president, and then you've got the rest. And it literally is about a third. That's not really a base to do much with. And I think institutionally, the United States is, trapped. Again, like we were talking about with Japan, it's sort of trapped by its own historical legacy in ways that prohibits it from tackling the problems of the 21st century.
Wow. Okay. I think that with that, we can wrap it up. For people who would like to follow you, Professor Powell, where would they go?
If they're so inclined, go to Substack. Is probably the quickest and easiest one. So that's my name. Just look for me on Substack. I think it's warwickpowell.substack.com or something like that. And there's plenty of stuff there. It's all free of charge, though I have been, again, flattered by a bunch of people who've pledged. And I'm not really sure what to do about any of that at the moment, because I think information is something that, wherever possible, I should at least share it, even if people think I'm mad or don't agree with it. But at least it provokes conversations and provokes thought processes and conversations like this. So, so for the foreseeable future, it'll just be there for those who are inclined to, maybe spend 15 to 25 minutes reading the materials when I push them out. I try to do something once a week. Lately, I've published 2 things a week, but it's largely been a response to immediate events, which I don't want people thinking that that's going to be the norm.
Well, for people who want to follow Professor Powell, go to warwickpowell.substack.com and highly recommend give him a follow. Thank you again for making your time and energy to come to our podcast. And this is I think we're in a fast changing world, and I do look forward to have you again on my show to speak to us on any upcoming events, because many things have to do with your field of study, actually. And so this is a very fascinating topic. I could geek out on this for hours, and I look forward to our future conversations.
Me too.
Well, thanks, guys, and thanks for listening to another episode of Silk and Steel Podcast. Until next time, bye-bye.